Okay na. Wait lang. Justice is not about excessive punishment. For most of its parts, rather, it's also about the prospect of reintegration, of protection, deterrence. But more importantly, it's about punishment. But in a world where individuals do not face exactly the same circumstances, we think that humanity is so much worse off if we base it on a future of if we base the futures of these criminals on a non-conclusive algorithm. That is why, coming from opening government, we say that a predictive algorithm is first an assimilation of all criminal records. By this we mean that we input the criminal history of these criminals on a certain record where they are compared to similar other criminal records to preemptively determine the likelihoods of re-offenses. And that is the reason why when we talk about predictive algorithms, they're basically considering other factors like education, for example. But for most of its parts, it's about how much you have committed a certain crime. For example, if you committed murder twice or thrice in your entire life, that part of your criminal history is also compared with other individuals who also committed the same crime in the same amount of instances as well. We think furthermore that this is based on precedence. It means that when you have a certain record that is being entered into the algorithm, the ways on how you are going to be subject to the criminal trials are based on the similar numbers that you're able to get out of that assimilation of criminal records. The last level to this particular characterization is that it projects a percentage on how much likely you are to re-offend. And that is why the opposition can argue that this is a preemptive stance for us to be able to have a just and proportionate punishment for these particular criminals. What's the problem with this particular policy? Firstly, there's no legal representation, there's no just representation on the part of these criminals anymore, because they are subjected immediately to the prosecution in these criminal trials, where there's less determination and negotiation of sentences, because now that will be conclusively determined by whatever is actually resulting from the predictive algorithm. Yes?
You said earlier in your speech that these algorithms are non-conclusive, so obviously they're not the only factor. Secondly, you said precedence is subjective. This at least happens when juries make subjective decisions. How do you use that?
The idea with the predictive algorithms and why algorithms will always fail is something that I will discuss furthermore. But at least, to respond to that POI, the reason why we don't want to use algorithms on our side is because we do not want we do not want to exploit on how heavy that influence of that algorithm could necessarily have on that sentence. Because regardless if you know that that person is educated, if you know that he committed thrice or four times, if he committed thrice or twice murder in his entire life, it's likely that if you compare that to other criminal records who also manifest the same data, it's likely that you will still punish him for that particular idea. That is why the problem that we pose coming from opening government is the quality of these particular judgments that are issued in the trials, and why this algorithm should not be conclusive, and how there's a disproportionality in the sentences that they're going to have on their policy. The first argument coming from Prime Minister is the principled discussion on why this particular predictive algorithm is actually bad. The premise is we base it on an algorithm that is out of precedence. The argument for predictive algorithm is that perhaps they could say that there's a correlation and a link between the patterns of human behavior. But this is not the case, ladies and gentlemen. Because when you talk about the crime, the act in their policy is already seen in their isolation. They may concede that there are other factors that could necessarily arbitrate that particular result, but they could never deny the fact that if they are able to see if they are able to see that there's a direct link on their policy of how much you were able to commit the crime over and over again, it's less likely that they would want these people to reintegrate properly. And it's more likely for them to even heighten the sentences, which is more destructive in that quality of justice at the end of the day. As we know, ladies and gentlemen, there are specific nuances to the crimes that individuals do. For example, if there's an instance of kleptomania, and there's also another instance of theft that was done out of poverty because he was so desperate to necessarily survive for a day. When you look at the instances of these situations, these are not the same things. Because one, you're dealing with economic and structural struggles, and the other deals with psychological effects of what it means to necessarily take away something from another individual. Or when we talk about environmental and cultural influences to individuals, like some states necessarily support men who actually oppress women, and we compare it to other individuals who just did it out of their will to necessarily oppress their wives or sexually abuse their sisters. These kinds of things already exist in society, but they will never be answered by the algorithms. So the second prong to this argument is why the algorithms will fail anyway. Because when you take a look at it, the algorithms only work when you deal with things that are inconstant. When these particular things are assessed in a vacuum. Because these are particularly, can be likened to machines, for example. Or how, when you necessarily use the algorithm in Facebook to be able to come up with things that are much more in line with your interests. It's because these things are absolutely black and white, not anymore. When you talk about how there's a clear distinction between these things, it's so much different when you deal with crimes. Because usually, the information that they're going to credit on their side is very limited or assumptive at best. Like when you talk about crediting education or other religious affiliations, there's a myth when it comes to the correlation of these particular information and how the crime was committed. That is why we said that at best, that blanket policy will not work for all types of crimes, because that's not necessarily the particular judgment that you're able to get out of that is not responsive to why that crime happened in the first place. You cannot subject them to a uniform crime on the basis that precedence has set that threshold for these individuals anyway. On our worst case, even though we don't subject them to a blanket policy, you subject them to the jury, where there is better representation, where there's more probability of negotiations before and after that particular sentence. That's why when you take a look at this perspective, our particular idea of justice may not necessarily be that fast, but at best, it is not subjected to something that's only taking consideration the things in isolation. That's why we're very, very proud to propose. Thanks.
Thank you, Prime Minister. To present the declaration of this debate, now sa mga
The world would be a better place if justice in the eyes of the criminal justice system would be easier to, for example, to be achieved in the very first place. But it became harder coming from government when they told us that these kinds of machines are very much biased in the very first place, or are not even credible in the very first place. They even told us that these machines should not be conclusive in the very first place. If you try to look at it, it's not conclusive. We concede. And that's why, coming from opposition, the clash is simple. We still believe that these these predictive algorithms should still be used in criminal trial courts. However, we still see that it should be used pre-trial. It should be used not as an ultimate basis, for example, to sentence an individual, but it should be a basis in the start, Mr. Chair, which means that you still have, you can still see, or you can still consider a lot of things. For example, the mitigating circumstances, or whether that person, for example, is only forced by his circumstances. That's why he actually committed the crime. Let's talk about a few things that Deborah told us. She told us that we should focus with status quo. We should let the She told us that we should let the judges. We should rely on the judges, for example, or let these people actually assess what kind of punishment or how long does that individual or does that criminal actually stay in bars, Mr. Chair. We have to understand that this is something problematic. Because first of all, Mr. Chair, if you try to look at it, these kinds of algorithms exist. These machines algorithmically determined assessment that aims and claims to predict individuals' risk of recidivism. Anyway, it's about having that individual having to assess if that individual will most likely re-offend or do the same crime in the very first place. That's just it. But anyway, Mr. Chair, we have to understand that before actually doing this, or before actually having an analysis, for example, of whether that individual will most likely re-offend or whatever, there are a lot of factors that are actually taken into consideration. Take a look at how there are geographic, socioeconomic background, or family characteristics that are actually taken into consideration before actually assessing these kinds of things. And so, if they told us that education attainment, or even, for example, your past criminal records should not be the basis, Mr. Chair, we tell you that it's false. Because ultimately, we want to send the notion that if you're a criminal, you do not deserve to be the same, you do not deserve to be seen by the law as someone or in line with someone or equal with someone who did not even do a crime, Mr. Chair. And that's why we think that it's actually justified. But more than that, Mr. Chair, they also told us that you actually own the characterization, for example, of these recidivism algorithms is that they actually only focus on education or how much you have committed crime, etc. And that's why we think that if that's the problem, then we're not going to use it if that's your case. But we still believe that you should actually that the factors, for example, in trying to assess whether or not that how long is the sentence of an individual should have is still legitimate in the very first place. That's why we think that it's not conclusive, but we still need to use it. First idea, Mr. Chair, on why their alternative is more harmful and why we should actually why it only justifies that we should actually use these kinds of algorithm. Because if you try to look at it, what really are the basis, for example, for it to be legitimate? If you try to look at it, we assess them based on geographic, socioeconomic background, and family characteristics, which may serve as proxy for race. This means that you're not being discriminative to them, Mr. Chair. This means that you actually only look at their background, for example, if they live in the ghettos or those kinds of things, Mr. Chair. And those important information are important because these are the factors that are actually seen or actually assessed by the judge, for example, in trying to assess whether or not that individual deserves a lower sentence, for example, or those kinds of things, Mr. Chair. That's why if you try to look at it, the picture that I'm trying to tell you is that if you're a criminal, if you committed something, you're not judged based on the arbitrary lens of the judge, for example, Mr. Chair, or different people, but you're judged on a fixed standard, Mr. Chair, and that is something that we see is very important, especially if you're trying to assess criminals in the very first place. But we also have to understand that these important factors are very much significant if you're trying to assess whether or not that person, for example, had clouded intention, for example, Mr. Chair, or was not in his purest intention when he actually did the crime. For example, maybe he actually did this crime because he was, for example, poor, and his situation forced him to actually do it, Mr. Chair. And those are the things that we see is important if you're actually going to assess whether or not that criminal, for example, should stay in behind bars for the rest of his life, or for the rest of his life, or what have you. And that's something we think is important, especially if you want the justice that is fair in the very first place. But then a second idea on why is it in the interest of the criminal justice system, but more importantly, of the state as a whole. Because what are the process used in assessing trials, right? We have to understand that the goal of the criminal justice system, for example, is for the deterrence of similar acts, Mr. Chair. We want them to not be able to reoffend. That's why we're putting them behind bars for a specific period of time, because that algorithm concedes or assumes that within that specific time, that individual will learn his lesson, for example, and not be able to do it, Mr. Chair. Is also the reason why, if you try to look at it, mitigating circumstances, for example, still exist in the very first place. Because if you try to look at it, it's not always conclusive. Because you still have evidence, for example, you still have hearing in the very first place. And that's ultimately important if you try to look at it. If these kinds of information are given, if you have your geographic, if you have the geographic fact, for example, Mr. Chair, because it means that if you live in the ghettos, Mr. Chair, and you were clouded when you had that, when you did the crime, ultimately it means that you still have that sort of reconsideration by the judge, for example, Mr. Chair. That's why we still think that whether or not these things are biased, Mr. Chair, we still believe that we should just change the standard and stick with it. Thanks.
Thank you, dear Professor. Extend the case of the government without some.
Mr. Speaker, justice isn't about just punishing the suspects to be able to avenge the victims or the people you hurt. It's also about trying to preserve the rights of these criminals, which is important for you to be able to uphold the primary pillars of the criminal justice system, for you to be able to preserve the credibility of that particular entity as a whole, for you to be able to create a better society in which the people actually trust the type of justice that it actually provides. There is no exclusive benefit coming from opposition, because they said that the only thing that these particular algorithms could actually credit are the tiny details, like how your geographical situation could be credited. But it's actually perfectly being co-opted in the type of policy that we have, wherein people are also going to, of course, be sensitive to the context of culture or what have you. But even worse, their policy is something that's going to be limiting, because the algorithms could never credit the emotions of the people that not only you affect, but the people that surround you as well. Which means that we think that those are important factors for you to be able to better provide a type of punishment that is appropriate and perfectly suits the type of crime that the person has committed. Primary rebuttal. Zhao has framed their policy as this. They said that their algorithm is going to be good because it might lessen the sentence and normalize criminals in order to give way for better rehabilitation. But number one, we think that that's not likely, because remember that the algorithms are already established as inaccurate and not necessarily considerate of all the details on the ground. So it's not likely that your sentence will always go down in terms of years. It could necessarily increase even and be abusive at that. But secondly, even if the results of their policy is going to be lower the sentence, we think that that we have to understand that it's also subject to the people who created the algorithm, by the way, which means that the ideas that they want to promote is something that's also present in the jury, since in the first place, the basis for the judgment is something that's similar. But lastly, we think that that's even more harmful, because if they're going to be softer on these criminals, think that deterrence is something that they could never uphold in their policy. Because what's the likelihood of you know, not committing the same crime again if you know that the algorithm is something that's forgiving or what have you? But before, yes.
Deterrence is going to work because you yourself said that precedence is a factor. But secondly, in terms of your argument, can you justify that human beings are better at making decision making at all times compared to having supplementary resources?
We think that precedence is something that's credited with the presence of the jury. But the beauty of it is you're not going to be compartmentalized with all the other criminals who had the same things. Which means that all the tiny details that you have committed all the way to that crime is something that's going to be credited. But other than that, we do concede that people may have lapses in terms of judgment. But remember that the jury isn't composed of a single individual, which means that they're going to be subjected to 8 or more people. And we think that that's a better option in terms of averaging the type of punishment that you're going to get, instead of being subjected to a black and white emotionless algorithm that isn't going to be perfect in terms of providing your justice. First argument, I'm going to talk about how predictive algorithms actually dilute the essence of the criminal justice system. And I'm going to elaborate on this with terms of centralizing on the aims of the criminal justice system and how they're never going to be fulfilled under the policy of opposition. So firstly, in terms of the punishment and the retribution of the criminals, because Deborah already elaborated on how these algorithms have the tendency to be inaccurate, especially since we are dealing with humans that are volatile and have inalienable differences in themselves. But other than that, what does this mean, right? This means that the projected sentence is not appropriate or proportional to the sentence, which means that you're necessarily going to infringe the rights of the criminals to be able to be treated as justly as possible. But other than that, it also affects the victims, assuming that the policy of the open opposition is something that's going to accrue. What if these criminals get a sentence that's shorter than what they deserve, right? We think that that's not necessarily going to be fair to the people who are being offended. But other than that, in terms of the quality of the punishment, I think that it's not something that's assured, because you remember that you violate the rights of these criminals. You violate their right to be able to be legally represented in criminal courts, or how you violate their right to be able to appeal for a shorter sentence, for other things in their lives to be considered. Because you have to understand that the algorithms are very influential to the point that a lot of states in the United States actually, prefer to listen to these algorithms instead of listening to these criminals who are petitioning for shorter sentences. Believe that that's very harmful in terms of that first goal. But on the second goal of the criminal justice system, in terms of rehabilitation, we think that it's already a considerable idea that your exaggerated punishment coming from these algorithms will make it harder for you to rehabilitate or reintegrate these criminals into society. Why? But we have to first establish, I'm going to prove first, why the jury is something that's better, right? Because we think that the coexistence of the society with the criminals is something that should be credited. And that's something that's absent with algorithms. Because they're only going to credit what happens during your sentence. How many hours are you going to serve, or where are you going to serve, or what institution are you going to be trapped into. But it doesn't credit what happens after your prison life. It doesn't credit the people you are going to interact with. We think that it's important that you preserve the choices of the jury in this, because they are society and they are the ones who are going to face the criminal at the end of the day. I think that that should be something that's credited as a goal of the criminal justice system to rehabilitate. I think that the only reason we preserve the credibility of the criminal justice system is to be able to provide a sentence that is something that's going to be approved by society, since they are the stakeholders that are going to be affected as well. But second argument, I'm going to talk about the interest of the state. We think that it's actually in the interest of the state because we provide better deterrence, especially considering that we consider a lot of details, even up to the emotions. But on the case of the opening opposition, they try to defend that it's going to lower the sentences, and we think that that's only going to, dilute the value of deterrence and make people even more lenient towards crimes. Thank you.
UTPF to extend the case of the government the opposition Here.
Once I stand before a court, narrating why I was raped, Mr. Speaker, that form of narration is also subjective to how juries assess the form of narration that I give. The point coming from opening opposition is that we're not going to defend an objective criminal justice system. Because what we're going to say that it has always been subjective, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, we're not also going to defend a perfect criminal justice system. Obviously, there are things there are flaws existing in status quo. But what we don't understand coming from opening government is that they told us precedence is subjective, therefore it's unjust. But Roma told us, we're going to account for the smaller details where you committed the crime. Isn't that precedence also? We think that to some extent, Mr. Speaker, precedence is a legitimate ground or a legitimate ground for you to consider how are you likely to commit that crime again, Mr. Speaker. We think we're clear coming from Jao that you want to send a notion that once you're a criminal, Mr. Speaker, we're not going to treat you as those individuals who did not commit crime. You must be treated also to some extent unjustly, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to answer 3 questions in my speech. First, let's clarify how is this algorithm being used in criminal trials? But secondly, why is this just? Even when we think to some extent they're already throwing false matter to us. But thirdly, let's talk about the idea, Mr. Speaker, why this is in the best interest of the criminal justice system. Before that, a couple of responses to them. Because, Roma pictured out a criminal justice system coming from up that we're not hearing criminals. This is not true. We're also hearing criminals. That's why we have hearings, for example. That's why we also bargain. We plea bargain, Mr. Speaker. That's why also we bargain for mitigating circumstance that to lessen our sentence, Mr. Speaker, to some extent. What happens on their side is that when you do not have a predictive algorithm, you leave, Mr. Speaker, the arbitrary decision to judges, Mr. Speaker, which we think is even more harmful considering the fact, for example, that the reason why these algorithms were created is to reduce bias that is existing already. Because if you talk about judges in America, there's a prejudice bias, Mr. Speaker, about black individuals. These kinds of problems that we think coming from opening opposition, which we think we're going to address. But secondly, they told us that you're not going to create an unproportional form. For example, form of sentencing. We think this is not true, right? To some extent, we always consider that before we issue a sentence, Mr. Speaker, everything has been considered. Because when you're already sentenced, you cannot bargain and go back, Mr. Speaker, that, how about I'm poor? These things are considered in the trial, Mr. Speaker. The point is, when you have that algorithm, Mr. Speaker, who is standard, who is to some extent conclusive, but we don't say it's conclusive at all, because there are different forms of subjective issues, for example, that we hear all about. We think this is better, right? Because we're going to prove later why it's unjust.
Like for example, where do you come from is also a conclusive judgment. Why are you likely to commit a crime? Because if I live in ghettos with many gangs, that can be, Mr. Speaker, a form of conclusive benefit, Mr. Speaker, to some extent. But considering, let's back to their characterization, because they told us algorithms are like you're going to pile up all of those things that that were happened before, all those things, and then it will be compared to different form of criminals. Then so what, right? The fact that you already committed the crime again and again, we think that that's already an indication that you can commit the crime again. This is the same reason, Mr. Speaker, why we consider medical records, right? Why we think that if an individual is crazy, he's likely to commit that crime. If an individual is a sociopath, those things, precedents matter, Mr. Speaker. If these guys told you that precedents do not matter, they do not defend criminal justice system at all. Last rebuttal, they told us that it's about necessarily preserving the rights of criminals. We don't think why we don't preserve the rights of criminals at best. But if they're going to defend why subjectivity, Mr. Speaker, is harmful, well, in fact, we've always been subjective. We think there is a large correlation, Mr. Speaker, to some extent, why necessary these kinds of things are assessed and why are those things just. Sure.
You're always arguing the best case that it reduces the biases. But what happens on your side is they conclusively sentence on the basis of that information. On our side, it's already part of the trial. So what's different?
Okay, if you are conclusive and become more racist at the extent, Mr. Speaker, coming from our side, what we're going to tell you is that to some extent, this may be a fault for criminal justice system, like you're going to sentence a bit harsher for them, or the worst case coming from our side is that we're going to increase the form of criminality. We think this is better when you have a standard form of assessing crimes, right? Because we think that to some extent, judges have different form of decision making, Mr. Speaker. But when you form a uniform, Mr. Speaker, form of assessment, this is why you have equality where individuals can be tried the same and equally to some extent. I'm going to argue, Mr. Speaker, why is this just in compared to existing mechanisms, right? Because we told you, coming from Zhao, that predictive algorithms are not always compiling all of your past behaviors and all of these things. But even if that's the case, right? We talk about sex, your geography, Mr. Speaker. Talk about your family background, Mr. Speaker. But why are these things just to begin with? Firstly, when you talk about geography, Mr. Speaker, when you live in ghettos, these kinds of things are taken into consideration. Like if you live with your mother who is buttered, Mr. Speaker, that's why you have a tendency, for example, to panic, Mr. Speaker, these kinds of things. When you talk about family background, when your father, for example, has left you for a very long time, or has even molested you, Mr. Speaker, these kinds of things are very important to consider to some extent, right? That's why we think that to some extent, these are things similar with socio-economic status. These are things similar why you can always bargain for that particular right. But this became a predictive algorithm, Mr. Speaker, because we can't just rely on an arbitrary bias, for example, of an individual saying that because this you're likely to commit a crime. But we're basing it on an algorithm, Mr. Speaker, to some extent. But even if it's worse coming from our side, like you give the worst case sentence to these individuals, why is this still better? It's still better, Mr. Speaker, because there are checks and balances that happens in status quo, right? You also consider like how necessary the evidence was bring upon the court, right? How are you going to sway your juries, Mr. Speaker? These kinds of things. The thing is, criminal justice system is multifaceted. These individuals try to demonize us, right? That if you use these algorithms, you're gonna infringe criminals. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, this is not a debate about them being good and us being evil, right? We think to some extent there's an inherent value, Mr. Speaker, of using predictive algorithms. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the criminal justice system has always been subjective and has not always been perfect. At least coming from our side, when you have a standard form of punishing individuals or to some extent giving a conclusive benefit, Mr. Speaker, we think it's better compared to when you leave it to individuals who have arbitrary forms of decisions, which to begin with are biased, Mr. Speaker, like white judges in the US. We're very proud of those.
Thank you, THW. That's then the case of the government side.
Mr. Chair, we think it's unfair for opposition to accuse government of being racist and being discriminatory at that, Mr. Chair, when they provide a standard that they themselves already conceded is inconclusive and is based upon things like, aside from, previous criminal records, also biological things like your ethnicity and your religion and your environment at that, Mr. Chair. We think that the very standard that they use is one that is racist, one that is unfair at that, and I'm going to prove to you that later in my substantive. But let's talk about the exclusive benefits that they're trying to fight for in their side. Basically, what they're fighting for is a speedy trial, Mr. Chair, and providing a standard at that, a standard which you can base your jurisdiction from, and these are the predictive algorithms, Mr. Chair. We in the government side are willing to, put those things aside or risk having a longer trial, for example, or having a more extensive way of trying to figure out whether or not a criminal is an accused person is actually worthy of certain punishments at that. Primarily because we think that these predictive algorithms are unfair at that. They mention how it's an assimilation, right? So it can also be used in other instances or in other crimes. Like it can be used as a basis to judge one crime and the other as well. But we don't think that every crime is the same, Mr. Chair, because there are different circumstances, right? Different factors that could have affected that certain scenario at that. Meaning, Mr. Chair, you can't use a standard or the same standard in all crimes at that. That's unfair, Mr. Chair. We don't think it's only limited. We don't think that you can judge a certain crime based off, for example, their ethnicity or based off their religion or even the crimes that they've committed before, and providing them certain punishments that are not proportionate to what they committed at that, but rather based on those unfair predictive algorithms and things like that. But before I go on, yes.
If you call our algorithms unfair, which is quantifiable data, what exactly is your standard for determining fairness?
Okay, so I'm going to explain that in my extension. First is how the prohibiting of predictive algorithms actually bring us the best form of justice, Mr. Chair. Because from the perspective of the state, it is in our interest to actually uphold a kind of criminal justice system that is not biased and that can harness the trust of your people at that. Because let's try to analyze what we believe is the best form of justice. We believe that when it comes to criminal trials, it is important to bring the kind of justice that is free from any form of bias. In this case, a trial that is solely based on the given evidences and statements within that scenario. Meaning, you shouldn't consider these predictive algorithms at that, Mr. Chair, because you're only creating an unfair trial, and welcoming these predictive algorithms in criminal trials allows these biases to flourish in the system itself, which defeats the purpose, defeats their purpose in the first place, right? To give you the best form of justice, to give you a proportionate punishment, a punishment that you deserve at that, Mr. Chair. Because the criminal justice system, because opposition tried to argue that this is just one of the factors being considered, Mr. Chair. But we have to analyze what necessarily is happening in status quo, right? How these very algorithms has affected results of trials, of existing trials at that. Let's start to talk about Brian Tucker, Mr. Chair. A guy who raped, a college dude who raped a girl and left her almost dying behind dumpster and things, and be almost dying behind a dumpster. But what kind of punishment did he receive, Mr. Chair? A very unfair and biased type of punishment, primarily because he was white and because he was privileged at that. But then again, we talk about, for example, minorities like African Americans and Mexicans who've been accused of things like, stealing, but getting a punishment that's worth more than what they should have, gotten. How we talk about how our fellow Muslims are fear trial because of the unfair biases that these judges have, primarily because of these standards, these predictive algorithms that they use in, trying to determine whether or not a criminal is guilty at that. If we analyze even how Joel said that if you live in the ghetto, you're more likely to be inclined to committing crime. This in and of itself is already a form of bias, right? A discrimination that can affect your judgment towards that person in trial at that. And these are the biases that we are trying to avoid that come from or that stem from these predictive algorithms itself. The kind of justice they provide is grounded upon by these unfair algorithms. At least on our paradigm, we are able to focus on the crime itself and make decisions and sentences that are proportionate to what the criminal has done. At least in our paradigm, it's more fair. But secondly, on how predictive algorithms become unfair for the defendant or accused. Because now, you have to make it 1,000 times harder for them to prove themselves not guilty, right? Because you put a bias on them. You base it off previous crimes and things like that. You infringe their very right to a fair trial at that, Mr. Chair. And we think that's a harm that the criminal justice system should not impose on its people. But more importantly, it's even worse for those who are unfairly accused, Mr. Chair. That just because you're an African American, just because you're a Mexican, you're gonna get an even harsher punishment. Because, in the algorithm, it says that once you're a minority, you're more likely to create, do criminal acts and things like that. But even if you are guilty, again, the problem with that is that you get an unfair sentence or a disproportionate punishment. So this is why, coming from government, we think that we should prohibit these predictive algorithms.
Thank you, MP. What is the case of
Mr. Speaker, the world we live in is one that is incredibly integrated. It's a world that features the use of big data, the internet, new technologies that are capable of aggregating massive amounts of information, social data, background, propensities. These are the types of information that are available in the public, and we've never had a better opportunity to collect and utilize these types of data. It's exactly this that the government bench tries to demonize by saying it's completely inaccurate, it does not hold credence, and it does not actually make sense to use them in a trial process. But they did this through a very deliberate and very short-sighted method of misrepresenting what big data and what these algorithms can do. We think that the use of precedents alone is an incredibly unsophisticated way to phrase these types of algorithms. These algorithms are computer generated. They're self-learning and recursively improving. What this means is that the product of science in general and the general progress of the world, the fact that we live in 2017, not the 1980s, means that technology is a credible standard to prove why these kinds of things are there. Number two, we say that the quality that they're talking about doesn't even exist under their model. They claim that these types of algorithms are legitimate only in a vacuum. But the vacuum that they're creating when you exclude algorithms is one confined to the all too common pitfalls of the human psyche. Biases, stereotypes, the things that they say that these kinds of standards happen are magnified when you allow these people to make decisions on their own. But they say, what if it leads to incorrect understandings or wrongful convictions? Number one, a wrongful conviction based on an arbitrary standard is so much harder to contradict as opposed to one that is quantifiable and independently accessible by the people. The fact that this is used by the state as a method to quantify these types of things means it's mandated to be transparent and vetted independently by scientists, statisticians, people who know how these kinds of things work. And this is exactly why their argument or misrepresentation that this is conclusive is patently false. The fact that these kinds of things have an irreducible amount of error means that there is always uncertainty. And that's exactly why opposition does not campaign for a perfectly automated legal system. It's one where we advocate that understanding the crime comes from the understanding of the circumstances, the incomprehensible amount of variables that can only be accessed by computerized algorithms. People are historically bad at math, they're bad at quantifying every little detail. But the fact is, we've built machines to supplant that weakness. We don't get tired, we don't make harsher decisions just because we get moody. Computers don't do any of these things, and when it comes to things like data gathering and assessing this information, it's essential that they have access to that. But we're not contesting this. What do we really mean by allowing these things in the trial process? Number one, we legitimize the use of statistics and a more scientifically rigorous method of adjudicating cases rather than the emotional appeals of things like testimonials. Because what are you left with opposition, with government rather? You are left with testimonials, subjective appearances, which can be worked by things like fear or your heightened emotional state at the time. Computer-generated models, predictive algorithms, these are the only legitimately unbiased methods by which you can understand what really transpired during crime. But let's understand, what does proportionality mean in this sense? Just because you're implicated in the crime does not mean you automatically get a heightened sentence. That's an incorrect dichotomy by opposition. If you're seen to be poor, and this is structural, and you're seen as a poor person more likely to commit a crime, the fact that this is an inherently unfair thing is a justification for why poverty can be used as a mitigatory circumstance. I.e., if you commit a crime, you get a reduced sentence. We think this is more conducive to a more efficient and a more just justice system, especially when the poor people don't have the lobbying capacity for heightened lawyers and higher things to convince the jury. These are the things if you get on the government side that we effectively punch a hole into their echo chambers, right? But let's go back to their argument on quality. We need to understand that the greater identity of these kinds of things legitimizes and furthers legal corporate abilities. The fact that your idea is based on simple testimonies is a patently outdated and ahistorical thing. The use of big data has been precedented by many things. The use of advertising, Facebook. These things are generally guaranteed to have better odds than human beings. They're not perfect. Yes, we concede to that, but they have to be better than human people. But ultimately, the fact is we want to have an environment where these kinds of things are capable of being adjudicated. Before that, sure.
Testimonies have nuances, but on your side, you base it on other external associations. But secondly, you're perfectly inconsistent. You're saying you're not advocating for a perfect predictive algorithm, but you're saying that understanding of crime means that you have your own based on that quantified.
The objective matters of a crime, i.e. a person died, is, for example, incontrovertible. But things like intent, emotional state, the fact that we adjust to things like crimes of passion and the mitigatory circumstances we talked about means that you can never fully reduce the idea of human beings being a part of the trial process. What we're doing is we're allowing the supplementary resource, the access to that data. And in so doing, we make things like the negligence of that data have consequences. If you make a decision as a judge with regards to data, you can be held in contempt by the court, you can be disbarred, you can have circumstances by ignoring these kinds of things, all because you consider data as an admissible form of evidence. This means that number one, the fact of using predictive algorithms is inherently self-correcting and always progressing at a greater pace because of the scrutiny we allow into this. But the second thing of our expansion is that we claim that these kinds of things legitimize and quantify legal concepts that are difficult to assume based on purely narrative or expository evidence from government sides. If you can quantify the risks of doing something or the probability, you have a measure, a yardstick, something that's better than your intuition, and something that's even more conducive to progress rather than the personalities of the individual people who make these decisions. We're not compartmentalizing people because we think this is worse under their model when you leave their biases alone in a vacuum. What we're saying is that these types of predictive algorithms ought not to be prohibitive because these kinds of things give insight into a crime that other people are often ignorant about. If you don't know these statistics, you don't have a counter-narrative for these types of biases, for these types of ideas. The mere existence or the mere admission of these kinds of things is enough to convince people that your viewpoint is not the only viewpoint out there. And with that comes a more nuanced, a more analyzed case by case, a more rigorous method to assess criminal cases that is conducive and what opposition believes for a better criminal justice system.
To summarize the case of the government, some people will be very good. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, the idea of you having the burden to prove your innocence 1,000 times more compared to others because of these algorithms being present is a disgusting narrative that government tries to debunk in society right now. Everyone is always presumed to be innocent unless otherwise proven because we recognize that there can be erroneous factors and there can be subjectivity that exists and no case is the same in status quo. Thus, having a standard, Mr. Speaker, on something that is extremely multifaceted is something that is extremely harmful coming from opposition. Two issues that I found in this debate. First is whether or not the policy of opposition is legitimate, and second is where do we put forward a better form of justice in status quo. Right onto the first issue, and rebuttals will be integrated in my speech. First, on the idea on why is the policy legitimate. Coming from opening opposition, they had this main and sloppy goal. That they can provide easier and faster justice because of these algorithms. You have a standard or a uniform of how you try to sentence these people or try to sentence the accused for that matter. And that it's not the ultimate basis of sentencing, so the harm that we try to provide to you isn't really clear or isn't really magnified for that matter. Responses. Number one, these algorithms affect the sentencing of these accused more than the opposition tries to picture out in this debate. It was already clear from past how she told you and how she grounded the idea of how these algorithms actually try to affect the sentences that this criminal justice system tries to put forward towards these certain accused for that matter. Regardless if they're accurate or not, we have proven to you, Mr. Speaker, how these algorithms are still benevolently harmful coming from status quo. But second, and more importantly, easier and faster justice only happens because easier and faster justice because of the presence of these algorithms only happen when these crimes are always under the same circumstances. We don't give the criminal justice system a way to be lenient and not analyze the case for what it really is. The system should not have a reason or a safety blanket for them to provide illegitimate sentencing because they can use these algorithms as a standard and as a uniform for them to be able to give give out these illegitimate standards for that matter. Checks and balances, Mr. Speaker, the have three legs are lacks on their side. Because at least on our side, we try to focus on pressuring these people or this criminal justice system as a whole to be able to put forward not only the idea of subjectivity, but the idea of being human for that matter, which I will discuss later in my issue. What did government try to picture out later after first issue? What did they try to picture out coming from closing government? It was clear coming from CAP on what we are trying to protect from our side, which is not the non-existence of biases in the first place. It was already clear from her on what we are trying to willing to put aside. We are willing to put aside these faster justices, for example, or this uniformity or standards that they're trying to put forward. Because we want to put forward the idea of social justice, that the criminal justice system that we are trying to picture is aggressive and determined and non-lenient for that matter. That we do not try to rely on all of these standards and we do not try to rely on a faster justice system just because it not necessarily being the fastest criminal justice system is always the more efficient way and the form of justice that we try to put forward coming from government. Therefore, the comparison is actually simple. We're already clear coming from our side on what we would like to compromise, and that's okay coming from our side because we want to have a criminal justice system that is aggressive and determined and not lenient and reliant on these certain standards and uniformities that opposition tries to present. But before our second issue, sure.
Again, what exactly is your standard? The perfection of human beings in regards to the behavior of cases? Again, we need to understand that these types of algorithms are supplementary, and just because we're using algorithms doesn't mean it's fast.
That perfectly leads me to my second issue on how do we try to perpetrate a better form of justice come from government. Because come from opposition and the main job of their whole case and the point coming from Hans is that they try to put forward the idea of standards and uniformity. That humans are volatile, humans are flawful for that matter, and that they can commit the same mistakes all over again and provide unjust sentencing, for example. That we can extremely be subjective, and that is something that's very harmful. Therefore, we need standards for that matter. But fine, let's try to consider the fact that there is a value that they're trying to protect. That they are against the idea of wrongful trials and that they are accurate. Fine, let's try to bite that over-characterization of these algorithms being extremely stellar that tries to point out the idea that humans are extremely flawful and that they are dumb for that matter. But why are they more likely to produce wrongful decisions even given that over-characterization, Mr. Speaker? The more you try to vacuum these crimes and the more you try to vacuum the system as a whole. Because coming from Hans, it was pretty much what you can conclude from his speech is that he was totally against the idea of humanity and subjectivity in the criminal justice system. He was trying to put forward that we don't want a perfect criminal justice system. But unless you put forward to it that judges are dumb, those people in the jury are dumb, and we need standards for that matter. They try to over-characterize this algorithm that they're not perfect, but they're made out of computers and they're made out of the best technology that can ever be that we can have in status quo. But why is that more likely harmful, Mr. Speaker? Because he tried to put forward an idea that there is no need for humans in the criminal justice system. That why not use computer for crying out loud if you try to put forward the idea that these algorithms are completely stellar and that they can solve all the cases that you try to put forward in the criminal justice system. What is government trying to put forward in this debate? It was already clear coming from Cass when he told you how he tried to value the humanity of the criminal justice system. How we still try to cater to the defendant, for example, of not allowing him to prove himself 1,000 times more just because of the presence of this conclusive or this overstellar algorithms in the first place. We actually want people or we want juries, for example, to relate to experience, to relate to sympathy, or to relate to testimony for that matter. And that's how you differentiate crimes from passion or to negligence, for example, because that will never happen on their side, because that's how you differentiate these crimes, right? You use subjectivity and you use human interference for you to be able to reach that goal of differentiating these crimes, which will never happen on their side because they try to over-characterize the idea of the stellarity of these certain algorithms for that matter. Comparison, Mr. Speaker, we would rather have a criminal justice system that is human and that is not completely idealistic and completely reliant on these technologies for that matter. To close, Mr. Speaker, we concede to the fact that our justice system may be longer. We concede that it may be more tedious, but no justice is better than the justice that happens without the existence of these standards, because that every case is put into blood and tears and not reliant on unfair algorithms. The motion should stand. Thanks.
to open the session for debate. And now some comments.
Here, here. Chief. Here, here. Chief, here, here.
Before you can put someone on the bars or before you can acquit an innocent criminal, you need to create a conclusive trial first. If that criminal is guilty or not guilty, you cannot just delay the trial for several years or decades because it also means that justice is delayed. That's why we think that the goal of our side is to make these kinds of trials more timely. That's why I will be talking about two things in my speech. Let's try to talk about the idea of trying to mitigate the harms that Gov talked about, and second, why a timely trial is in the interest of criminal justice system, and I will be proving the comparative on why the evidences will not work on their side. First of all, let's try to go to the first issue. Let's try to counter what did the closing talk about. Because you know what, their harm is that if you're a criminal, you have so much burden to prove yourself because of our system. Number one, when you think of it, it only works at our worst case scenario. But when you talk about on their model, those kinds of biases still exist, right? For example, if you're a criminal, you still have so much burden to prove yourself in courts, for example, and things like that. But at the very least on our side, when you have these kinds of algorithms, at least these kinds of statistics will defend you. Compared when on the government side, the societal biases will make it harder for you to defend yourself. At least on our side, we prove that if you're an innocent individual, you have the statistics, you have the quantitative data that will support you anyway. So we think that the kind of harms that they're talking about will be limited, ladies and gentlemen. But let's try to go to the issue of the idea of evidences and why the delayed justice is harmful on their side. Because what they talk about is the idea that there's no legal representation on our side. But firstly, they never prove why on their model, criminals can represent themselves because the way that to represent yourself is evidence. But why is the evidence is of a less quality on government side? Because number one, when you see status quo, the search for evidence is very hard. If you're a criminal, you need to find witnesses that is willing to defend you. Or maybe if you're a victim or you're a plaintiff, you also need to find evidences as well. What is the harm when you allow human emotions to exist, as what Hans told you? Number one, these witnesses may feel the fear, for example, because they're just humans. They can feel emotions. They may not have that kind of incentive to be witnesses, for example. But we think that drawing the motives on their side may really be pernicious. Because when you think of it, drawing the motives on status quo can be based on strict talk, or maybe it can be based on speculations. For example, there are crimes done because of love triangle and things like that. Why is it harmful on government side? Because even if all crimes are treated as unique on government side, it is hard to see the gray areas that these guys want. Because their contention is, we want to find the gray areas. But number one, we prove to you that it's very hard to find. Because number one, these gray areas, such as very unique incidents, may be very personal, that the judge and jury cannot sympathize into it, right? But number two, these gray areas may be very complicated. Like, if the crime is a structural revenge, it may already be very hard to correlate the cause and effect. What does it prove? The quality of justice on government side is diluted, and we think that this is why the algorithms are important, because at least it can be an evidence on the ground. But let's try to go to the best case scenario, assuming that evidences still exist. Firstly, they never prove why on their model, criminals can represent themselves. Because the way to represent yourself is evidence. Because when you think of it, even if criminals have evidences such as testimonies, number one, it is arbitrary or subjective. We have so much number of trials for one criminal case because what witnesses say may change over time. But number two, when you talk about evidences, it can still be tested. Like, for example, you test evidences for so much years, for example, we think that that's a delayed justice. But number three, the worst case on their side is that trials can be politicized. The fact that you can choose the best lawyers to defend you, meaning that the kind of trials on their model can always be politicized. The fact that possible motives may change, or when there is no sufficient evidence, the judges can easily shift their decisions right away. Probably, these judges will create trials based on conscience or maybe based on their personal perceptions and emotions. Go.
you say that you don't want emotions, then also say that the result of this particular test is merely supplemental. So isn't it a concession that either there's really a value in having that emotion, or second, you're subject to the horrors of conclusively sentencing the criminal?
At least on our side, the quality of evidences is more of a bigger quality compared on their side. Because remember, our contention is about the evidences or the quality of evidences that you bring in, ladies and gentlemen. So we really do not care about that. But what is the importance of the harms that I've told you? If the basis of trials on government model is evidences such as raw data or maybe testimonies, they need to prove by number one, these evidences can be conclusive right away. Or number two, what is the likelihood of even getting significant evidences at the end? Because in a comparative, if evidences or better conclusions is based on human perceptions, ladies and gentlemen, we think that it's harmful on their side. At least on our side, it has a quality. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, it proves that the government's model of justice is delayed. The fact that the gray areas is very hard to find. Why is delayed justice harmful? Because number one, the justice is not served on the victim and the criminal. Because if you're a victim, you need to wait for many years to wait for the decision. Or maybe if you're an innocent criminal, you suffer in prison while waiting for the decision, ladies and gentlemen. This is why algorithms is important, because at least it speeds up the trial, because individuals do not need to wait for too long anymore. We think that is criminal justice system's interest, because the justice can only be served once the trial is finished and the final sentences or judgments are already given on the ground. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that's why we think that the quality of evidences is important on our side, because that's how you're able to solve these kinds of trials. But let's try to go to the number two. Let's try to also answer the idea of the discriminative, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, it is not to be fair at all times, because we can see that sometimes the criminal justice system can also be subjective. The same when you allow many police to be scattered in ghettos or in areas where there is rampant violence, the point is you cannot apply a fair standard on different individuals if you know the environments where they live in is always different, ladies and gentlemen. So we think this is why the idea of justice is better on our side, because at least it can be more timely. At least individuals do not need to wait for many years for them just to find the final decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Opposition leader, you may now proceed. Give us a few minutes to deliberate. Thank you for the comments. Kailangan siguro yan. Ilang days pa yan? Okay, so kaya ito. Stop nyo guys. Okay, stop. Okay, stop.